All right, thank you all for showing the day after an exam. That takes, well, actually doesn't take much. Just comes to classes. You should be here. Why people don't show up the day after tests, I guess they just assume nothing will be done ever after tests. But that's not the case. We're getting right into existentialism. And today's lecture, I think, is a necessary starting point for a number of our discussions going forward. You didn't have a reflection today. You do have one for next time. Yeah?
Your class is not cumulative, correct?
I'm sorry?
The final isn't cumulative?
Correct. It is not cumulative. So good news for those of you who did not enjoy analytic philosophy. Existentialist, continental philosophy, way different. Bad news if you were hoping for something cheery and light. This is not it. It's not light and cheery, right? So it's good and bad news, right? You get a little bit of both. I don't mean to transition from good and bad news into the discussion of your tests, but I have not graded them all. I do not submit grades or return them until I've graded all of the exams for consistency and so forth. In fairness, in case I've made a mistake, I can go back and review it, and I try to grade them all equally. So I will have those done by this weekend. Certainly I'll return them to you on Monday, but you can check online. I'll have the grades posted by this weekend probably.
Would there be any form of curve if there was multiple questions that everyone missed?
Yes, I hope I'm a reasonable fellow. Enough such that if there's a question that everyone missed, that it's probably something with the question. We didn't cover it enough, or I haven't found that yet, but obviously I'll be open to that, no doubt. So anyway, for those who just came in, I'm going to be getting your tests back for Monday. I'll have them back for you for sure. And I'll have them graded. You'll have them online. The grades probably maybe Saturday or something. But don't sit there waiting on your computers, waiting for the grades. They'll be there. The study guide I've posted for the next exam, which is the final exam, which is not cumulative. It's there. I'm going to amend it, I'm almost certain, but the first few questions are fine. So you can use those to start looking at. I posted that actually on Monday, so you should have had a chance to look at that. Download those questions and start working on them already. I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's the best way to prepare for this class, the best way to prepare for the exam for this class. Is to start looking at those study guide questions. I think toward the end there's a number of them that I'm going to change a little bit, and there's going to be a bump in the schedule coming up, which when I get more of the details I will explain it to you, but as it is now we're on track. Which takes us now to our discussion. I'm going to remain seated today if that's okay with everyone. My ankle's bothering me. I don't know why I'm telling you that, as if you'd say, no, you must stand, teacher. I'd say, sorry, I'm not going to, so I don't know why I asked or even mentioned it. You've heard of this term, existentialism, I'm sure. You might have been introduced to it via literature classes, because a lot of the authors that we're going to be looking at, starting with Jean-Paul Sartre in particular, the mode of presentation is literary in many cases. It's a kind of narrative, oftentimes first person, account of a particular idea or a particular philosophical concept, and it is not an attempt at straightforward reduction, translation into some logical form. It's an attempt at getting at the essence of existence. Existence is in the very concept here. But there's a number of themes that we'll be looking at. But before I want to do that, I want to get into some astronomy, which I don't know if you caught that in existentialism as a humanism. You see any of the astronomy in that? Just kidding, there's none. But there's some of importance that I think we should start with. By the way, that's what's going to happen to our sun when it dies in about 5 billion years from now, and that's what it's going to look like. And what are we going to look like when this happens? Things are going to be bad. This is how we look in anticipation of this fact. Those are actually Justin Bieber fans, but you couldn't tell, could you? Are they moaning over the horrors of existence and the fact of our inevitable demise? Or are they just cheering Jay Beebs? Hard to tell. Hard to tell in this. There's a great Woody Allen line, or a line from a Woody Allen film where this kid is coming home all sad and morose, refusing to do his homework or eat, and his mother asks him, "What's wrong with you? What are you doing? You need to do your homework." And he says, "What's the point? I just learned in my astronomy class today that the sun is going to explode." And what happens when the sun explodes? What happens when it becomes when it goes through the planetary nebulous stage of star death? Such a great phrase. What happens?
Planets for Dunzo.
I'm sorry?
Planets.
Did you say Dunzo?
Yeah.
Really? Interesting. That's making light of the end of our universe, isn't it? By saying it's Dunzo? But it's accurate. Not our universe.
It's an astrological term.
Dunzo?
Yeah.
Yes, I believe that was before Stephen Hawking passed. He said, "We're Dunzo." And yes, I said universe. That's not what I meant. Stars die all the time. But if our star dies, unless we find somewhere else to go, then not only do whoever's alive when by the way, we've got a long time to go, 5 billion years. I don't know that humans, in fact, I'm quite certain the path that we're going on, we are not going to make it another 5 years. Well, I'm sorry, 500 maybe. But what's the point of this? Inevitably, by star death, by global climate change, global weirding, nuclear holocaust, inevitably, the argument goes, all of human history will be wiped out. It's not that I'm going to die and my memories will merely carry on in my children and their children's children, I hope. But all of collective humanity and everything humans have ever done will be gone. And one response to this is to basically huddle up in the fetal position and realize and think to oneself, what in the world is the point of it all? Why do anything if it ultimately amounts to nothingness? That's a kind of overriding theme in existentialist literature. In particular, people like Jean-Paul Sartre, people like Simone de Beauvoir, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Camus, Albert Camus, lots of French. And what is going on at the time that those particular people are writing historically? That we might understand their bleakness. What was it? World War II. And that was not a good time. They wrote in between 2 world wars and then after. And imagine living through, as most of these that we'll be looking at did, they lived through the Great War, they called it. Not because it's going to be great, this is an awesome war, but it's the war to end all wars. Because they thought at the time, no one is stupid enough to do this again. No one would ever engage in warfare given the technology that we have now with flamethrowers, with machine guns, with tanks. No one ever is going to repeat this. And of course now we call it World War I, implying that it did get repeated. There was a sequel, and it basically hadn't ended in many respects. There's a lot of discussion, of course, historically as to the causes of it. But think about living through both of these periods, and you get an understanding, perhaps, of why one might have a rather bleak outlook. Oh, and then they go away. So I guess that's what I meant to do. Did I mean that? I guess, yeah, there they go, gone. So that was more clever than I thought. I'd forgotten I had that built in. I'm going to start a discussion of existentialism going all the way back to the 1600s with Blaise Pascal. As he says, and this is perhaps strange to you, what the hell does Pascal have to do with existentialism? How many have heard of Blaise Pascal? Mathematician, philosopher, theologian, unfortunate first name, Blaise. It's really not actually, if it's blaze, like fire, that's not bad. But it looks like blase. So, what was it?
It's the name of my dog.
Oh, spelled that way?
No, with
Ah.
a Z.
See, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's lame. This is
It's the name of my neighbor, but I don't know if it's spelled like that.
Do you have a neighbor named Blaze?
Blaze, but I don't know how it spells it.
Well, ask him. Anyway, Blaise, that's his face right there, by the way. That's his death mask. I'll talk about death masks later. It's fascinating that there are such a things. He says, the eternal silence of infinite space fills me with dread. It's not just the term dread that's of existentialist import. Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher, or Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher of the 1800s, is going to borrow a lot from Pascal, and we'll see that lineage. But there's a lot from Pascal that we see in the atheistic existentialism of people like Camus and Sartre, believe it or not. Kierkegaard is a theistic, a believer, but an existentialist. Pascal, there's other things that he said, I think. Oh, no, not there yet. I guess I haven't got to it yet. Pascal will tell us, I should tell you first, he had a kind of religious experience, a near-death experience, and that led to him becoming, at one point, he died very young, as you can see, but after this conversion kind of experience, he spent all of he gave up mathematics, which is what his background was, his philosophy, and he just worked on apologetics with justifying Christianity. He carried a description of his religious experience in his pocket everywhere he went. And he's the one who gives us Pascal's wager. So in the philosophy of religion class, which, can you sign up for classes yet? Still too soon. I thought it was. Oh, anyway, philosophy of religion, that class has gone through all the curriculum committee crap, and so it's going to be there. So sign up for it. If I put all this through and nobody signs up for it, I'm going to be so frustrated. I'm not blaming you ahead of time. I'm just saying, sign up for it.
This video with Melita, can we take it again?
That's not philosophy of religion. That's world religions or comparative religions. Philosophy of religion hasn't been taught here before. But Melita, hopefully she'll be on the panel on philosophy of religion. Did you get in touch with Melita?
She's actually the only person who hasn't responded yet.
She has not responded yet?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that'd be great if she does. Yeah, she's great. Yep.
Do you have time to give a quick kind of rundown and maybe compare it to world religions?
What's that? Oh, the class. I don't. Not now. But I will by the end of the semester. I will do this. Comparative religions gets at everything.
Guest speakers.
Guest speakers, yeah. But to teach world religions or comparative religions, as it's called here, requires knowing a lot. I always taught it from a philosophical bent, but you have to know rituals, you have to know history, you have to know sociology, you have to know geography. There's so much involved in world religions, comparative world religions. Philosophy of religion doesn't look at it from any particular viewpoint. It looks at the arguments. It looks at, or the existentialist perspectives, lived experiences of those pushing a particular view. Whether it's dealing with arguments for or against the existence of God, the primary question of whether or not faith is rational, what is the domain of religion versus philosophy versus science, are they compatible, are they incompatible, problem of evil, problem of issues of religious experiences, mystical experiences, and many, many other things having to do. Ethics does, for the vast majority of human beings, their ethical principles, according to them, come from their religious principles, how that gets evaluated as well. So that's a nutshell of the difference between the two world religions, is looking at comparing Buddhism to Hinduism to Taoism, Confucianism, and so forth, which is a lot broader, I think. Philosophy of religion is getting at primarily the ethical, logical, and metaphysical bases of faith as such. Okay, if you want to know more about it, come to the talk whenever it'll be, like the 20th, I think, of November, and then we'll get into that in more detail. All right, so Pascal has a lot to say about this, what existentialism is, and I think he's the precursor of it. Let me give you a little bit more by way of Woody Allen. I just quoted Woody Allen. This is from a movie, Play It Again, Sam, where he's trying to meet a girl who happens to be not necessarily an existentialist, but a nihilist. Does anyone know what a nihilist is?
Wait, is this one with the paint?
Yes.
We believe in nothing.
Nothing? Yeah, okay. Nothing.
From the Big Lebowski, the nihilist.
Oh, yeah.
We believe in nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
That's good. Well, that's similar to this. Let's watch. It's not going to explain it all. Oh, good Lord. That's hilarious. You know what? This is right. This is right that happened. Fucking Barbie.
New Barbie Dream Camper Set, adult design.
That's so perfect. I didn't mean for that. Wow.
Hey,
She's great.
Go ahead, speak to her.
No, are you kidding?
No, go on, let's go to the movies. Come on, go on, you're gonna try.
We're gonna
That's what we're here for, huh? Go on.
Casual. It's quite a lovely Jackson Pollock, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
What does it say to you?
It restates the negativeness of the universe, the hideous, lonely emptiness of existence, nothingness, the predicament of man forced to live in a barren, godless eternity, like a tiny flame flickering in an immense void with nothing but waste, horror and degradation, forming a useless, bleak straitjacket in a black, absurd cosmos.
What are you doing Saturday night?
Committing suicide.
What about Friday night?
His last question was, what about Friday night? Do you see? Now there's a lot of absurdity in that. I don't know how we're supposed to respond to that. I don't know how many takes they had to do before they got that right.
Do that in one breath.
I know. I was breathless watching that. It's just, it's very exhausting. If one sees the world in this fashion, that there isn't any kind of ultimate meaning and ultimate purpose, it could lead to this kind of outset that's pretty damn bleak, right? And we'll talk more about this question that Camus raises, the question that's raised here. A lot of existentialism themes in Woody Allen's films. Whatever you think about the man as an individual, his philosophy, his themes, his philosophical ideas come out in his films. And I think he's one of the most philosophical of directors and actors in a way too. And if we have time, we'll show in full his movie Crimes and Misdemeanors, which hits on just about every motif within existentialism. But when you think about the response to this, when you think about how do you respond to the conception of there being the inevitability of death? You look at the universe from the previous picture. This is probably just an image of a galaxy, right? Not the universe as such, of course, because we don't have pictures of the universe as such. But we have ideas of what galaxies look like. And galaxies are pretty big. Our galaxy, the Milky Way, is 90,000 light years across. And it's mostly empty space. Empty. It's mostly uninhabited. There's not, as far as we can tell, conscious beings running around, although I'm told we'll find some life on Mars fairly soon, whatever that means. But it doesn't seem amenable to meaning, purpose, function. It does seem like life exists on our planet. That gets into some interesting philosophical questions as to how, and theological questions as to how that is. But what good, what purpose, what function, what is the universe for? How has it benefited us? Where can we find meaning and structure? And especially when we look at where we fit in the cosmos, we're a tiny, tiny, tiny little speck. The Earth is. The Earth is in a galaxy that's a middle-sized galaxy, right? We're not even at the center of our galaxy, much less the center of the universe. We see how potentially insignificant we are, which raises a lot of other themes. If we see the absurdity in this, and this term absurdity is going to come up, I'm not going to cover all these concepts now, obviously. Absurdity is something that Camus will introduce, borrowing from philosophers before him. It's freedom that we'll talk a bit about today, and again when we get to Sartre's Being and Nothingness, chapter 2, we'll get to that in November. But how do you respond to a world that seems to be made without us in mind, ultimately? And there's different ways of responding. Some can respond with rage, with fury, with scorn, as Camus in part will suggest. Others can try to reason it through philosophically. Others can utilize hope or faith to maintain a sense that this isn't all that there is, But then once you've adopted that, Sartre will say, you've ultimately removed your own sense of responsibility, and you're in what he'll call bad faith. Or there's another option. I mentioned this Woody Allen sketch in the intro class when we talk about the philosophy of humor. It could be that maybe laughter at this predicament is a legitimate and interesting response. And why that might be, I'll return to that when we look at Camus. But if you look at these concepts, they all seem kind of negative. Even freedom has a negative element to it when Sartre discusses it. Because he doesn't just say we're free. He says we are, what is it? Condemned. We'll see. Condemned to be free. You talk about buildings being condemned. What does that mean? Don't go in it. It's uninhabitable. It's dangerous. It's a bad thing. All of these seem to be somewhat dread, boredom, anxiety, finitude. That means we're not going to last forever. Bad faith, which is a concept we'll spend a whole bit of time on. Alienation, which is a term that goes back to in Karl Marx's concept of alienation. Authenticity, that sounds more positive, but Sartre and Heidegger, who he gets the term from, and Kierkegaard before that, basically says very few of us are ever actually living a fully authentic life, whatever that means. Authenticity is not something that you accomplish. You don't get done with it. I'm now an authentic human being because I've got a shirt that says independent on it. I make sure nobody has that shirt. I'm an independent. I'm an authentic individual. And commitment of existence and nothingness too. All these concepts we'll return to, and perhaps a couple of others. Why those particular concepts? Why these strange concepts? Why are these the important elements, the important concepts to study human reality and human existence? And notice, it's always talking about human existence. It's not talking about, as the ancient pre-Socratics did, what is the nature, what is the ultimate stuff of reality? What can we reduce things to? We see that today in contemporary cosmology as well. This is more of a melding of Socratic, Platonic philosophy that is interested in humanity, but the existentialists are less interested in universals. I'm interested in the human. I'm interested in individuals. I'm interested in lived experiences of individual concrete people. The scientific categories, force, function, matter, cause, neuron, and so forth, like the historical, metaphysical, epistemological concepts in analytic philosophy, they don't get at the human condition. There is a human condition for Sartre. There is not a human nature, a focus that we'll get to in a moment. If you look at the history of Western philosophy, let's say starting with Plato, for whom we are told, or from whom we are told, all of the Western philosophy is merely a series of footnotes, you see this drive for abstraction, for universal contemplation of the forms, where individual perceptions don't get us to knowledge. In fact, it's our senses, our perceptions that get in the way. The goal of a Platonic philosophy is to get to universals, is to get to the truth in some sort of absolutist sense. And in contrast to that, Greek logic, abstracting, universalizing tendency to find principles that tell us about human nature, this influences Aristotle too, human nature, that there is something it is to be a human, and that's already set before you are born. There is an essence to being a human. The reason you are qualified as a human is because you fit that essence, according to this traditional view, where our essence comes first, before we even come into existence. To be a human, humanity has an essence, in a kind of universal and abstract sense. And we can know a lot, we can make decisions, we can understand, we can have meaning based upon the rules that apply to such beings. And we have rules, ethics, and those rules and ethics are universal. And they apply in an abstract sense. This is very different from existentialism. And we start to see that with Pascal, Blaise Pascal, and especially with Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard takes his individuality to an extreme, as you're going to see when we look at the example he gives of Abraham and Isaac, the binding of Isaac in particular. So you see a history of, if you want to sum up Western philosophy in extremely broad terms, way too broad, but this just gives you the two parallels. You've got ancient Greek philosophy, and you've got Hebrew, Christian, Islamic theology / philosophy. And in particular, the Hebrews look at philosophy, look at reality as particular. They don't see it in universal terms. They see it as in more individualistic terms. And there's an attempt at, if you want, intermingling or finding some kind of happy medium or compatibility between the theology of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and the philosophy of the Greek and Roman thinkers throughout. And this we see all the way up until, I think, the 20th century. And then we get a different sense. And here I'm back with Pascal, not his death mask anymore. What a monster then is man. What a novelty, what a portent, what a chaos, what a contradiction, what a prodigy. These terms, I think, will make a little bit more sense when we get more into the motifs of existentialism. This is from his pensées, which means thoughts. These are his thoughts basically in defending Christianity, ultimately, but also in attempting to make sense of the human predicament. He was a contemporary of Descartes. He broke with Descartes' dualism. Descartes, if you recall, thinks that we are ultimately essentially minds, and we have bodies that carry us about, and then our minds can eventually decouple. It's not clear that Pascal sees that. Pascal seems to see the two extremes of us, that we are essentially body and we are essentially mind, and that is a contradiction. It's a contradiction that leads to all sorts of interesting phenomena, that we are, as Kierkegaard will later put it, or Kierkegaard, a kind of in-between. We are a contradiction in the sense of being in between the finite and the infinite, between the temporal, the eternal, the possible, and the necessary. Concepts that will make more sense, again, when we get to Kierkegaard, in particular his religious ideas. But this idea of humanity being a contradiction, and not ignoring it, not trying to solve it, so to speak, but live with that tension, is another theme within existentialism. You see a theme, too, found in Heidegger, who was a very strong influence on Jean-Paul Sartre. And it's very interesting that he was a strong influence for various reasons, why it's weird. First of all, when you know more about Heidegger, you'll look at that face and think, well, that's kind of an eerie face now. Now that I know about his past, and we know more about his past than we had only 10 years ago. In the past couple of years, the black notebooks have come out, which reveal that Heidegger was not just sympathetic to the Nazi Party, not sort of forced into doing things and saying things publicly on behalf of the Nazis, but indeed he was to his core a Nazi. And this has changed a lot of people's perspective. In fact, there's one rector of his a museum of Heidegger's stuff. He was a Heideggerian scholar his whole life, and he quit his job after learning of and reading about these new notebooks from Heidegger, which makes it very clear where he stood politically. Interestingly, though, Sartre was aware of this. Sartre fought on behalf of the Allies during World War II against the Nazis. He was captured by the Nazis, was imprisoned, in fact, a POW for about 9 months, and yet still utilizes, in fact, quotes from Heidegger quite often. It's interesting. This key concept that you read in Existentialism as a Humanism for today comes from this. The essence of Dasein, which is German for being there, or their being, basically talking about humanity, lies in its existence. The essence of Dasein, which we'll talk more about later, lies in its existence. And here he's dealing with some really interesting metaphysics. In his Being in Time is a very long text and very some argue unnecessarily confusing, where he coins a lot of new terms, doesn't clearly explain what they mean, presumes you know what he's talking about as he goes through it. It's one of the most difficult texts, I think, in the history of philosophy, is Being and Time. In fact, if you look at Heidegger, who was influenced by Husserl, he was taught by Husserl, who's a phenomenologist. In fact, can you see the next one? No, I don't. Husserl also extremely difficult to read. Let's see, there's Husserl, Heidegger, Hegel, who's also influential of them. He's also extremely difficult to understand. You go all the way back to Heraclitus. You see there's a motif here. Philosophers whose last names start with H are historically difficult to understand. I don't know why that is. Except Hume. Hume's okay. Yes?
Is he saying here that existence precedes essence, or is he saying that they essentially are at the same time?
So he's going to, let me put it this way, Sartre is going to take from this, that's what I want to focus on. I don't know that I can explain this without getting entirely into his ontology. His ontology is basically a classification of stuff that exists, that is. And so Heidegger is very much interested in studying of being and how we as beings emerge from this greater being. And I don't think, actually I don't want to go into that. I think that'll just confuse things. And I'm not prepared to, I think, talk about Heidegger other than to show this is the language that influences Sartre. I'll explain Sartre's view, because I want to focus on, that's hard enough. Sartre's view is going to take this and run with what he takes from it, is that to the extent that we are human beings, it can't be that we have an essence before we exist. That would make no sense whatsoever. And we'll see why that is. In fact, Jose Ortega y Gasset says ultimately what Sartre's going to say in a different way. Humanity, man, is an infinitely plastic entity of which one may make what one will, precisely because of itself it is nothing save only the mere potentiality to be as you like. That's a very broad claim, and perhaps too strong. Heidegger wouldn't agree with this. Heidegger talks about there being of us being thrown into situations, being thrown into societies in which we're already engaged with others, that we already have a language, a culture, and so forth. These situations that we can't do as we like or be as we like. Sartre goes to an extreme with this and says, yes, we are responsible for the situations into which we're thrown because we're responsible for what meaning we give to each of these situations. And this opens us up in such a way that allows for a kind of absolute freedom. And you see Gasset basically pushing on that theme that we'll talk about in a bit. You see another contemporary of Jean-Paul Sartre's, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who will, at the same time that Sartre does, be very much influenced by what's known as phenomenology, which is a very, to break it down into the most general terms, a phenomenologist is somebody who wants to try and study perception, consciousness from the first-person perspective, as they would say, pre-reflectively. That is to say, before I give it a theory, before I try to apply my analytic mind, my theorizing mind to what it is that I'm seeing. Ponty references Cézanne's The Card Players. Cézanne did about 5 different versions of this painting, and he uses other examples too, but he uses Cézanne as an example of a representation of subjectivity that's found in existentialist motifs. So the individuals are fully ensconced in their own subjectivity. How art, as opposed to science, gets at existentialist motifs. Art gets you the subjective, the individual. Science gives you the abstract, the universal. Actually, you were just looking, I suspect, Philosophy Club talked about philosophy of art today. And it is interesting. There's debates about this. This is Ponty's perspective, and it's a common existentialist perspective, that art gives us specific perspectives. You look at Impressionism. It's giving a perspective of what things are seen to this individual, not give me a realist interpretation, right? Go back to Aristotle. The best art is that which best mimics reality. They used to have competitions of who drew the best art. Aristotle talks about the painter Zeuxis, I can't know how to pronounce it, who was so good that the people who would judge the art couldn't tell that the grapes were fake, that they were painted, and they would walk over and try to eat them. And say, oh my goodness, it's a painting! And then he win because it most closely resembles reality. Well, what does that mean? It most closely resembles reality in fooling you. It doesn't give you really the perspective, the individual perception, as many impressionist painters do. And this is an example. I can't get into this one now. This is supposed to be, I don't know what it's supposed to be. There's a lot of existentialist motifs that I don't have time to get into with respect to this, but it would be interesting to look at a series of artworks that come out of the 20th century that have existentialist ideas, because it may be that in many cases the language that we have is inadequate to address the phenomenological experiences of the individual. Which takes us to this point from Sartre. There's the first image of Sartre, I think. There's a lot more of them. He was very photogenic. Even with a squirrely eye, he was very photogenic. The world of explanations and reasons is not the world of existence, he says early on in his book, Nausea. It's a terrible title for a book. But that's what the main character experiences upon realizing some facet of reality, what he'll call the mere contingency of existence. His existence is contingent, it's dependent. He doesn't have to be, he's not a necessary being. Yeah, sorry.
Is he the one where follow the eye,
Oh,
see if you gets the other side?
Yeah, his eye, when he was younger, he lost his sight in one eye, and they didn't have, I guess, he just didn't do anything about it. He didn't put an eye patch on. He could have, he'd be pretty cool. He just let the eye go, and it went. It just went all over. You'll see. You'll see. I feel like this is a bit of an ad hominem on my part. Robert Solomon, who's a very famous scholar of existentialism, puts it nicely. The linearity of logical argument too easily eclipses the multidimensionality of experience. That's either just a really arrogant way of saying, words sometimes don't get at existential experience. And argument seems oftentimes to leave something out. Think of it in terms of linearity, the categorization. We like to categorize things. It's easier to do that. We like to put things into boxes. We like to say it's either this or it's this. And of course, reality is hardly ever that clear cut. It's much more vague. It's much more ambiguous. And I think this fits with Sartre's mode of argumentation. I mean, he does give arguments. And there are arguments that we can pull out. We won't do it today. We'll talk about freedom today, but we won't do it until we get to being in nothingness. But he does have an argument that if we wanted to, and I do put it into standard logical form later on, which is hard to do because you feel like you're missing something. So I think maybe it's beneficial. We read the story. We look at the examples. Instead of in the place of straightforward logical deductions or syllogisms or argument forms, what the existentialists will oftentimes use is story, narrative, and examples. Lots of examples, lots of thought experiments or actual real-world cases. Sartre will give us a lot of those. Here he is, JP. You can start to tell a little bit. I think it's the right eye that's going to be going. That's not really important. He did extraordinarily well in school. He started studying philosophy fairly early, influenced by Descartes. In fact, he is Cartesian up to a point. He doesn't accept his mind-body-substance dualism, but the basis of Sartre's philosophy is, in a sense, Cartesian. This concept of individual consciousness as the starting point. This also leads to him being influenced by this guy over here, that well-bearded fellow, Edmund Husserl, Return to the Things Themselves. This again is what we now call phenomenology, which is just a fancy word for how phenomena appear to us. and an attempt at getting at least for Husserl, a kind of mathematical certainty. Husserl was seeking certainty from a Cartesian perspective, but looking at it through the lens of first-person consciousness. This has a great deal of influence on Sartre, again, because it's an attempt at how things appear prior to philosophical categorization, right? Before we put it into its boxes, using logic, using language, bless you, and so forth, we're engaging in the phenomena as they appear. We are bracketing our philosophical attitude in a way, where we don't try to utilize our contemporary sciences to categorize things. I'll talk more about that when we get into Sartre's metaphysics, such that it is. There's a lot of pictures of Sartre, and a lot with him and Simone de Beauvoir. That was especially nice up there, where they're just shooting a gun, probably somewhere in Paris, at a cafe. They went to cafes all the time. Sartre was prolific, so was Simone de Beauvoir in their writing. We'll read Simone de Beauvoir later, but I should note, and I've done this before, every time I talk about Simone de Beauvoir, I almost always introduce her as the existentialist philosopher who was friends with and lovers with Jean-Paul Sartre. I tend to do that. I didn't do it today, except for just now, to show that I shouldn't do that, because it's a kind of minimalist. It's just, here's Simone de Beauvoir, and the reason she's well known is because she's seen with this guy. That's inaccurate. She has her own philosophy. We'll look at it in particular with the second sex, selections from that, and her ethics of ambiguity. The themes are overlapping. She was friends with, off and on, lovers with Jean-Paul Sartre. They were polyamorous, I think is the term that they used, which basically means friends with benefits, or what do we say today? We're going to sleep around. We're not going to be tight.
It
Yeah.
means you have multiple loves.
Right, but we would use the phrase today. I mean, an open.
Benefits is more like physical.
Yeah, that would physical. An open relationship. That's what I guess it would be, right? So you're seeing other people, type of thing. In any case, and they had a very interesting life together. Sartre lived until 1980. He joined the military in 1939 for France. Worked as basically dealing with weather. He didn't have to do a whole lot that was dangerous. His role then later in the French resistance was oftentimes perhaps exaggerated a little bit. But he did have a lot of time when he was, believe it or not, during World War II. He wrote while in the military, and he did write while a POW as well. So he'd be added to my list of philosophers who've done philosophy while in prison.
Is it okay to write about the military when you're in the military?
Is it okay to write about the military when you're in it? What do you mean?
I don't know, like is there some kind of like you're betraying your country's secrets thing?
Oh no, he wasn't writing about the military. He was writing about philosophy. So, and I don't know. I mean, yeah, if I'm a prisoner of war, I'm not going to talk about where my troops are. He was writing about, let's see, while a prisoner of war, he started writing what became his novels, Age of Reason, which is a 3-part series. He wrote like 20 pages a day, and of publishable stuff. Millions of words. He was incredibly prolific, and he wrote well. He's known within literary circles as a great writer, and in fact, that's the fundamental method. That's what he's most known for, I think. He's a public intellectual, and so when he died, France's conscience has died, somebody once said, so his funeral was well attended, even though he had detractors, as I'll get to a bit later. But it's interesting, this concept. What does he say? What exploded all that was the fact that one fine day, I received a call-up paper and was obliged to go off to the barracks at Nancy to meet fellows I didn't know who'd been called up like me. That's what introduced the social into my life. Up till then, I believed myself sovereign. I had to encounter the negation of my own freedom, through being mobilized in order to become aware of the weight of the world. That, I think, is fundamental. This is him thinking back. These are French troops who were captured. That's nuts. It would be coincidental if Sartre was in that group, but this is representative of this. But this concept of no longer seeing myself as wholly independent from others. There's what he'll take from Husserl, this concept of intersubjectivity. And even as he's a prisoner, he says, actually I need to get the whole quote here, because this isn't the whole thing. This is something he wrote back in 1944. He says, 1944, he's saying this. The war's not even over yet. And in 1944, things were going better for the Allies, but it wasn't certain. Never were we more free than under the Germans, in different translations. We had lost all our rights, first and foremost the right to speak. We were openly insulted daily, and we had to remain silent. We were deported en masse because we were workers, because we were Jews, because we were political prisoners. Everywhere we looked, on the walls, in the newspapers, on the movie screens, we kept seeing that foul and insipid image that our oppressors wanted us to believe was the way that we really were. Because of all this, we were free. What the hell does that mean? Since the Nazi poison was seeping into our very thoughts, each accurate thought was a victory. Since an all-powerful police was trying to coerce us into silence, each word became as precious as a declaration of principle. Since we were hunted, each gesture had the weight of a commitment. Notice the language here, freedom, commitment. These are essential concepts that arise out of the horrors of, in this case, quite explicit oppression. The often frightful circumstances of our struggle enabled us to finally live undisguised and fully revealed that awful, unbearable situation that we call the human condition. If there is an absolute, if there is a universal with respect to Sartre's conception of humanity, it has to do with our condition, and our condition has to do fundamentally with freedom. There isn't a human nature, but there is a human condition. After the war, he did a whole lot. Not going to go all into this. He edited and started his own articles with others, including de Beauvoir and Merleau-Ponty. He started getting into politics, in particular influenced by Marxist ideology, and he became himself a Marxist for a bit, changed his mind after a while. But you see, he had some interesting ties high up in the Marxist echelons. That's Castro and Che Guevara, and there's Simone de Beauvoir as well, just hanging out. You see, he also went to jail back in 1971, around the same time that Bertrand Russell was imprisoned. In his case, he was protesting anti-nuclear. He was protesting nuclear proliferation. Sartre and de Beauvoir here. I'm not going to show the whole thing, but it is interesting to see them. In 1971, there's de Beauvoir. There's Sartre passing out a pamphlet, very liberal, left-leaning political pamphlet that was continually being shut down by police forces, oftentimes with brutal force. And here they are just being arrested. It's interesting to see this. Anyone speak French?
Demandez la cause du peuple contre les séquelles arbitraires.
Yes. Yeah, and there's the name of the... Good.
They knew though, they named the Second War in French, like the World War II wasn't called World War II. The translation, like it's translated, it's the deuxième. They purposefully put it instead of like just the First War and the Great War, the ending war. They wrote it for there to be another war. It is pronounced as if there was a third war. They were expecting another war.
Well, what's a third war?
Deuxième is like second versus like if they were to say second, like the Seconde Guerre would be the second war, number two. But instead of us World War II just naming it, they're saying the second war as in there isn't a last one. Ours was like the Great War, World War II. We named it after. They were like, nah, this is the second war. We're not done.
Yeah. Huh.
So they and that was a big thing with philosophy too. It was like, why did we name it that way? Like, because a bunch of people were like, why are we calling it that? Like, we have two words for the word second. Why are we using the one that?
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know.
The end of a concession.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's super weird.
Sartre, because of his literature and his writing, he won a Nobel Peace Prize, which was pretty cool. But he rejected it because, and there was a sizable prize that went along with it, but he had already had Marxist leanings. He was worried about bourgeoisie type perspective. He didn't want to be seen as falling prey to that. It's kind of like Bernie Sanders accepting money from huge donors. It's like, screw that, I'm not going to. I don't know if he did the right thing by denying this. I don't know that anyone else who's done this, who said, yay, well, you won the Peace Prize, the Nobel Prize. Nah, I don't want it. I don't like the image. I don't like the image it sends to people about me. But he rejected it, and the people loved him. This is his funeral procession. I'm not going to show it now. This is in 1980, and millions of people flocked to that funeral procession. He was that well known, and he had detractors, of course. In fact, in the Existentialism is Humanism article, this is a speech he's giving. You see that some of his detractors, some of them are communists, some of them are Christians, as we'll see. And he's trying to explain, trying to clarify what his view is. That takes us to the reading, which I now realize I only had to read 17 pages. I should have had you read the whole thing. It's 34 pages. That's not actually that much. If you read the whole thing, awesome. If you haven't, I suggest doing so over the weekend. Catch up. It's only 34 pages. There's some juicy bits at the end that I should have had you do. But this is a speech he's giving, and he's trying to clarify. He's one of the few people who, if you ask, who's an existentialist, who calls himself that, Sartre does. Not many other people did. There's a few. Norman Mailer took it on as a term. Even Camus didn't like it. Heidegger didn't like it. Nietzsche and Kierkegaard existed prior to this concept, to this term being used. De Beauvoir would have taken it on, I think. What is existentialism? Existentialism is a humanism. What does that mean? And that gets back to the quote from Martin Heidegger and what Sartre's conception of it is going to be. So existentialism. There's his eye. You see? It's totally going the other direction. It's going to go all the way around. And by the end, there's going to be two eyes in one socket. It's the weirdest thing. What they, that is theistic and atheistic existentialists, have in common is the fact that they believe that existence comes before essence, or that you must begin from the subjective. He starts this off right away. Right away. Existence comes before essence. That's not a very revealing phrase, but we kind of see it a little bit already with Heidegger. But he's being explicit with the ordering. He's not just reversing the order. He's not just saying Aristotle was wrong. Plato was wrong. The history of Western philosophy was wrong. Science is wrong, where scientists try to categorize a human being as having a specific essence of necessary sufficient conditions, such that if you don't match that, you're not a human. You'll start to see why existentialist themes can be utilized and have been. In particular, we'll look at two theorists of contemporary philosophy, George Yancey and Lewis Gordon, how these concepts can be used to try to explain what's going on with racist oppression. Because with racist oppression, we see essentializing stereotypes. That is, we turn someone into a thing. And we don't do that wittingly with Aristotle and Aquinas and Augustine and Plato in the sense of trying to turn an individual into a thing. But this is a logical consequence, or a phenomenological consequence, of assuming that my essence precedes my existence. Essence. What do you think of when you take... could you get that back? What do you think of when you hear essence? What's that word imply?
The idea of an object.
Idea of an object? What do you mean?
All the aspects that make up a thing. So everything that you are, have been, or will be is your essence.
Or will be. So you can have an essence before you've done anything. That's an Aristotelian Platonic worldview. And a Christian worldview as well. And a scientific worldview. It's the worldview of most people at this time. And maybe even most people still today. So Sartre's conception here is somewhat radical. Good. Did you want to add to it? Oh, I saw Did I say hand? I didn't hear you? Oh, but your hand was up this area. I interpreted that as a question. You'll have to say something now. No. Unless you want to. No. Okay. All right. Maybe this helps. Existentialism. Claire suddenly realized that existence precedes essence, and she was free to kill all the gods. Now, this is not quite what Sartre's saying. Sartre is starting from the same point that Friedrich Nietzsche does, that God is dead. And it's not abundantly obvious in this article what the argument is against God insofar as a typical standard argument. He doesn't give it. He's starting from that presupposition, basically. And Nietzsche, as we'll see when we get to the philosophy of religion section with existentialism, is going to do something similar. But there is a consequence. Ultimately, existentialism, for Sartre's perspective, is an attempt at making sense of us and our world in the absence of a God. How can we do this in the absence of there being a divine creator of essences? So he mentions in the reading a paper knife, and that might have been confusing to you. What the hell's a paper knife? Is it even a knife? Because you were probably thinking, when I first read that, I remember thinking, a knife made out of paper? You didn't have that thought? You knew what he was talking about?
It's a knife that you use to open a place.
I know that now, but when I first read it, I thought, what are you going to do with a knife? I mean, you can cut somebody with a paper cut, I guess. Do you see where I'm going with that? That's ambiguous? Anyway, he mentions the paper knife, and he mentions other things like cauliflowers and other things. And what's significant about the paper knife? Its essence precedes its existence. What does he mean by that?
It was meant to be a paper knife, so like it was created by us, crafter or whatever, as a paper knife. So it first had the purpose and then it was created.
Yes, it has a function. In fact, that's how we define certain things. We say that this is a marker, and it's a good marker insofar as it writes. And it does. It's kind of nice. I didn't write well, but if my function, my purpose was to write well, then I would be failing at being a human being. Luckily, even for Aristotle, that's not my function, that's not my purpose, that's not my telos, that's not my end. This term telos, teleology, study of ends, purposes, functions. When we make things, we have ideas of what they're going to be. That's a good opener of letters. I mean, who opens letters with a letter opener? Who gets letters anymore? Have any of you written a letter in the last 5 years? Oh, really? Okay.
5 years, yeah. That's
5 years is a long time to write a letter. One letter in 5 years.
Yeah, I'm saying nobody does it anymore, but I'm wrong.
Expectations.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So you do still write letters. Okay, I apologize. I apologize. I'm wrong on that. Maybe it's just me. What's that?
Not really. It's like a once every 5 years kind of thing.
Who did you write it to?
My grandpa.
Only once every 5 years?
It was just one time. Yeah, it was my first year out.
Well, that's good. I bet he was blown away when he got that letter. Hopefully he had a penknife. Or, is it? Yeah, a penknife. What's a penknife? Something else?
I think that's where it's shaped like a pen and the blade comes out.
Okay, well, whatever that is. It has a function, it has a telos, it has a purpose, even before it is made. In the mind of the artisan, in the mind of the creator, it's got an essence. And we can determine whether it's a good one or bad one based upon what its function is, what it is to do. That's its essence. The essence of a paper knife is to open envelopes well. The essence of a marker is to write well. This is established before it exists, do you see? Why is it different than humans, with humans?
Well, because then what would be the essence
Of what? Of humans? There is no essence of humans?
Well, I'm not
Is
saying,
that what you were saying?
I'm not saying there isn't, but I'm saying I don't know it is.
Do you know what the essence of humanity is?
No.
Oh, I thought that you were going to answer that.
No, I was just gonna say like there's nothing that had us in mind.
Oh, similar to the Pascal concern. Although Pascal is going to argue that there was, that would be God. But we are, or to there's nothing that had us in mind, whereas something had, an entity had intentions and desires and a purpose in mind with that.
I mean, unless you believe in panpsychism. I don't know.
But then, how does that?
Because then you're invoking that consciousness is like an entity in itself.
Yes, but that doesn't necessarily imply, so Chalmers, to go back a bit, wouldn't necessarily imply that that is what's giving intentionality. Consciousness, not all consciousness has intentions in the sense of here's why I'm thinking this. All consciousness, to borrow from Husserl, is intentional. It's just a different use of that term. It just means it's about something. Consciousness is always about something. However, back to your initial point, there's nothing that had us in mind in the way that artifacts clearly are things created. Yeah, go ahead, and then Isaac.
When you say for this thing, do you mean for anything besides things with consciousness that we know of?
Yes. Oh, and then that could take us to issues of panpsychism. Yeah, that's a tough one. Yes.
So it's like arbitrary.
Anything. This is it was before it was even existing. Somebody had a concept of it, drew it out schematically. It has a function, it has a purpose that is determined prior to its existing.
What about like a tree?
That's not obvious,
Okay.
but for Sartre, there is a kind of, we can talk about species in a way that they don't have freedom. Freedom is essential to this question here. Sartre's not going to give non-human animals freedom, or as far as I know, he doesn't speak to that.
So
But that's an interesting question.
if you were to say that existence precedes essence for something like an animal, and we eat animals, and we also make wonder meat, which is
Wonder
almost
meat?
Well, the Beyond Meat.
Oh,
meat
Impossible Burger and the Beyond Meat. Sure,
Impossible
sure,
Burger.
yeah.
If we can manipulate it to where it mimics chemically exactly how animal meat is comprised,
Yeah.
would that mean that that particular wonder meat has its essence precedes existence, but for the animal, its existence precedes essence, but they're virtually the same thing?
No, they're not the same. Sartre would say, if the animal has freedom, which is to say it projects itself forward into nothingness and creates its being as it chooses, then to eat the animal is to use it as a mere thing, as to see it as functioning as an object for our pleasure, which would be problematic for taking away its freedom. I don't know that Sartre gets into that, to be honest. But the wonder meat, I've not heard it called that.
I think any name really.
That's not a living thing to begin with. So he wouldn't. That's not a conscious thing, and so that wouldn't be an issue for him. Go ahead.
Would a reductive materialist like Patricia Churchland not believe in essence? Or how would she respond to that kind of claim?
I do not think I think she would be with Aristotle up to a point. Aristotle's conception of the essence of humanity is rationality. We're reasonable beings. We are, borrowing from Socrates, we are rational, featherless bipeds. Churchland and other reductivists are trying to get at what consciousness is, and so in a way getting at necessary and sufficient conditions, and maybe consciousness is a necessary part of humanity, but it doesn't distinguish us from other animals, doesn't distinguish us from other creatures. I think she would probably be in line with the scientific school of thought that tries to get at what human nature is, that there is a human nature. Like Steven Pinker, for example, and other contemporary psychologists, neurobiologists, even evolutionary scientists, that there is a kind of nature, even though it is evolving over time. And I think there would be a difference between that and the extreme freedom, the robust libertarianism in the metaphysical sense of existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre, who don't like, as we saw before, the attempt to artificially categorize what a human being is prior to that individual's capacity to choose. So let me go through a bit more of this, and maybe it'll better clarify that answer. Paula, did you have a question as well?
No, my back hurts.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Let's see. It uses this example. I'm not really good at doing that. That's God creating. If human beings were like this, then if God did create us, then we would be nothing more than paper knives, do you see? Because our essence would have been predetermined, regardless of our choices. In fact, any choice we make then becomes hardly free. We've lost our sense of responsibility. I can put it all back on what? It's not my fault. God made me this way. Right? What can I possibly do? And even if I don't believe in God, Sartre says at the end, you didn't have that part of the reading, I think it's toward page 30, even if I don't believe in God, even if I do believe in God, even if there is a God, that doesn't take away our freedom. We're still engaged in this concept that we'll talk about, bad faith. We'll have to spend a lot more time on that when we get to his chapter, From Being and Nothingness. What is different about these things and human beings? Well, human beings are projects. We are a process. We are literally projecting. He uses different concepts of project, different senses of project. Literally projecting into a future that is not yet fixed. We are not a cauliflower. He says that. Maybe you knew that already. You didn't need to hear that. But we are constantly working at this. And you're never done. It's becoming as opposed to being. It's not a state of stasis. You don't ever say, I'm authentic, I've achieved authenticity, and then you're done. That leads to complacency. And you'll see, it leads to bad faith. There is no human nature because there is no God to have a conception of it. There's no human nature that we can appeal to and say, here's why I did the thing that I did. Here's why this choice makes the most sense. There's no human nature that's given to us by God. There's no human nature that's determined by the laws of science. Each of those two different poles is a removal of our responsibility. I can't help doing what I did. I'm a man. I can't help doing what I did. I'm a woman. I can't help doing what I did. I'm a human being that's made this way. It's genetics. It's psychology. It's culture. It's the laws of physics. And he takes this to its extreme. It's the situation that I was born into. No. You take responsibility in how you make meaning in that particular situation. There are, for Sartre, no excuses. He's the kind of coach that gets pissed at the kids who say, why don't we all get a trophy? Maybe that didn't work. But you kind of get to the point. There's no excuses. I don't want to hear it. You are totally and completely free. Yes, and then yes. And I'll give that argument later, not today. Yeah.
Is he saying that there is no human nature because there is no one to create one? There is no one to say this is what your nature will be? And does he talk about our natural, our biological path?
Both. He'll talk about that in terms of, he was very much interested in his early writings on emotions. And he'll talk about that and how emotions can bubble up. But nevertheless, we're still responsible for those too. Later on, he tampons down a bit. At one point early on, he'd said, we're responsible for our own births. In which, of course, he doesn't mean you chose to be born. But once you're thrown into the situation in which you're in, and he says this here too, the moment you're thrown, and I wrote somewhere, like when you're an infant? I mean, what the hell are you talking about? Surely not infant. And I think what he basically means, on page 12, he says, that is what I mean when I say that man is condemned to be free, condemned because he did not create himself, and he was not created, yet is nevertheless at liberty. And from the moment that he is thrown into this world, if we're being uncharitable, we can say, the moment I'm born, infant, you're free. Quit crying. Take responsibility for yourself, you little shit. I mean, that's one way of reading that, but that's not a charitable reading. I suspect, although he doesn't make it clear for us, he's talking about when we get to this age of reason, perhaps, 10, 12, 13? I'm not even sure. 15? Then he goes on, thrown into this world that he's responsible for everything he does. The existentialist does not believe in the power of passion, because that's passive. He will never regard a grand passion as a destructive torrent upon which a man is swept into a certain action by fate, which by therefore he has an excuse for them. So there are no excuses. Did you have more to your question? 1, 2, and 3. Yes. Then we got our.
If you think that you have the freedom to that change like your circumstances and change how you view your life and stuff. Like if we go back to, I don't know, was it Nozick or whatever we were talking about how like if you think you are like the bootstraps thing, like if you can make your life however, and then like whatever good things that come to you like are because you like work hard at it.
Yes, that's Nozick. In fact, I had a quote somewhere, or I wrote a note on the outside, the border, writing Nozick's name, and here it is, page 20. Oh, you didn't have that. Why should we? No doubt this stuff. In life, a man commits himself, draws his own portrait, and there is nothing but that portrait. No doubt this thought may seem comfortless to one who is not made of success of his life. On the other hand, it puts everyone in a position to understand that reality alone is reliable, that dreams, expectations, and hopes serve to define a man only as deceptive dreams, abortive hopes, expectations unfulfilled. That is to say, they define him negatively, not positively. And he goes on saying, basically, you are nothing else but what you live. And that reminded me of Nozick on self-esteem. Shouldn't my self-esteem be determined by what I do, not by my circumstances? And Sartre seems to be pushing a similar line for very different reasons there. So it does sound like Nozick.
You would use that to like perpetuate the myth that like if people are in bad circumstances, it's because of the things that they do.
Sartre is very cautious to avoid saying that, but it's not obvious how you avoid that logical consequence of an extreme libertarian view of metaphysics, of free will. You are fully responsible. Then are there no victims? Is no one ever a victim? Because how can I be a victim if I'm responsible for having put myself into this position? He doesn't want to say that, and you'll see that when we look at conceptions of bad faith that are used by scholars around his time who are suffering from overt oppression, such as colonialism, like Frantz Fanon. Sartre writes the preface to his Wretched of the Earth. And in fact, Sartre's very sympathetic to the use of violence against colonialism, against colonial France that's colonizing places where Fanon was from. So he's aware of that. And I think he tempers his views later on. So he's a bit too aggressive with his conception of ultimate freedom that says no matter what the circumstance, I'm responsible for it. So that's a legitimate critique. But I want to come back to that with the arguments that we give for him and free will.
So you said that like he's very extreme in terms of how much freedom you have, and like no matter circumstances you're born in, so you still have a choice. And then in regards to physical laws?
No. He wouldn't say, no, I can't fly away.
Yeah, that's
So he said, no, he's aware of that. That doesn't, so if you remember our discussion of free will, I think Bobro put it really nicely. If I have more than one option, I have a choice. All it takes is one or the other. That, in the most basic level of metaphysics, is itself a kind of freedom. I can have limited choices. There's political consequences. In fact, he's really focusing on that. He's more interested in the political, social, ethical, and the individual level of freedom. It's not just, I'm free to do what I want, but my choices, in fact, have effects on everyone around me. When I choose, I'm not just choosing for myself, although of course it's looking at it from the individual subjective perspective. I'm choosing for the world. I'm choosing for humanity. How absurd is it to think that our essence precedes our existence? This image, as some of you have seen before, should illustrate the absurdity of it. Pay your parking fee before existing. Yeah. One letter's missing. It's an important letter here. You can't be responsible yet. You can't be anything, anyone. Your essence is not yet. It's absurd to even think of an essence prior to existing, to put it in those terms. So we are condemned to be free. Let's wrap this up. We are free. Man is freedom. That's confusing. I'll talk about that next time we get to Sartre. But this means we are in anguish, a concept he gets from Kierkegaard. Here we see the condemned notion. Why are we in anguish? I'm sorry, go ahead.
So would he say that men have always been free, or that we've gained this freedom from like becoming more intelligent?
Do you mean evolutionarily speaking?
Yeah. I kind of When you break it down
Yeah.
that way, I don't know.
That's a very good question. He doesn't focus on that, but I think he would consider it once humanity became social, and he would accept Aristotelian notions of man as essentially a social animal. Once we became social animals, all the questions of freedom, of consciousness, and all these things start to arise. As an individual, by themselves, to the extent that that's even a human being, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So, however long ago it was that we became socialized human beings, these concepts of existence come into play, which is a long time ago. So Sartre wouldn't think that this is like, in Hegelian terms, we become, it's the absolute becoming aware of itself at this time and not before. Hegel, interestingly, thought that it happened during his time in the country in which he lived, which is perhaps way too particular and coincidental. So yeah, I think that's a good question. I think he would have that as part of our lineage going back quite a ways. Now, what's the anguish? What's the condemnation? Remember, we're condemned to be free. Condemned is negative. How is that the case with freedom? Freedom's positive. You're condemned to be happy. What? That sounds contradictory.
Like responsible for all our actions and everything we do. If you're not like free, then you have some like escape from responsibility.
That's right.
Because that's why what he was kind of getting at with that whole like we were never more free than we were being oppressed. Because if you're under that, if you do something or whatnot that you're not necessarily proud of or happy with, you can blame it on an externality. Like
that's right.
Because the Germans were oppressing us, I did this or what this happened. But
yes.
If you are truly free, then that means everything you do, you have some semblance of control over.
That's exactly right.
Kind of overwhelming and cause people to despair.
That's exactly right. And Sartre, writing at a time and being part of the French resistance, and the idea Vichy France, which basically is part of France that just stopped fighting and allowed the Germans, the Nazis, to come in. There are a lot of collaborators. He thought that this was absurd. What could we do? The Germans had weapons. What could we do? This is taking away your autonomy. This is taking away your freedom. It's taking away your responsibility to say, these external forces made us act this way. This kind of freedom causes extreme angst, anguish. We are now responsible. It's analogous to when you leave home for the first time. What happens? With great freedom comes great, to borrow from Stan. I used to think it was Stan.
Great power comes great responsibility.
Right, to paraphrase Stanley, I used to think it was just Stanley, but Stan, last name Lee, from and others. With great power comes great responsibility. With great freedom comes great responsibility. I'm on my own now, free. Yay. But now I've got to choose what to buy at the grocery store. It sucks, especially if it's a big store and you have to choose from many options. It's difficult. That's a trivial example. But that freedom of choice, as you were saying, Jonathan puts it right on your shoulders. And it's not just a freedom of responsibility for your individuality. It's a choice for all, something we'll have to talk more about later on. Real quick.
Isn't there like a psych thing where like people would rather choose from like 3 ice cream flavors than like 50?
Yes. And there's another psychological phenomenon that tries to explain why gurus are so effective. Because we like to have others tell us. And we like for others to feel certain in what they're telling us. That's why we sometimes seek presidents who are not ambiguous. They're like, here's the problem, I can fix it, and I alone can fix it. And we like that, some people do. And that feeling of certainty that they will do it for us takes away a lot of burden. Yeah?
Does that tie back into like the self-imposed immaturity?
Yes, it does. That's very good. Sartre was very much influenced by Descartes, but also Immanuel Kant. That's exactly right. What was I going to say? How much does he... If there's an objective component, if there's something that Sartre takes as fundamental, it's our human condition, and that is condition related to freedom. And he takes this seriously. He'll call you out if you are not being authentic. He'll call you out if you're not taking responsibility. To the extent that there's an existentialist ethics, this is it. You didn't have this to read, but you should have. I'm sorry. Those who hide from this total freedom in a guise of solemnity or with deterministic excuses. I shall call cowards others who try to show that their existence is necessary when it's merely an accident of the appearance of the human race on earth. I shall call scum. It may be a mistranslation. How do you say scum in French? Maybe.
I feel like he wouldn't say scum. I'd say he'd like, like you're a giant asshole.
Yeah, good. I like that better.
Yeah,
Yeah.
scum doesn't translate well.
So this is the translation we have. I call you scum. Dude, that's harsh.
Yeah.
All you're saying, I just think our existence is necessary, that there's a kind of, there's no contingency to our being. Really? You're scum for that. We can't, we're out of time. So for next time, what do we have? I'm sorry to hold you over here. You have Dostoevsky, Notes from Underground, pretty short, and a selection from Albert Camus' The Stranger. We'll start with this next time. Where is it? Oh, his example of an existential choice. I want to start with that. Reread that section. This choice to stay with his mother, the example he gives, or to go fight in the war. We'll start with that, and then we'll get into Dostoevsky. Yeah. All right. Yes. That's still starting. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk to you because I was absent on Monday. I was sick over the weekend. So
You didn't take the test?
No.
Okay.
So I was hoping there was some content